Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, finally, it's Biosphere Odds and Ends. Yeah, you thought I was done with Biosphere. And we're not freaking done yet. Geir Jenssen is one extremely prolific dude. There is a ton of stuff that he's put out over the years outside of his core studio albums. Soundtracks, collaborations, field recordings, sound installations, compilations of rare tracks, stuff under other aliases, under his own name, so many releases. Well, I'm not actually going to talk about the stuff that he's just put out solo under his own name. It appears to be just pure field recordings and a couple of random soundtracks. Didn't seem that interesting, and I figured this video is going to be long enough as it is. And there's a handful of random singles here and there that I didn't discuss here either, so sorry if there's something you wanted me to go over that I skipped. This video is not all-inclusive for every release he's ever put out or participated in to any degree, but it's a lot of them. Also not going to go super in-depth on these to the same extent as my regular reviews. Some of these albums I only listened to like once and a half and jotted down some quick thoughts, and that was about it. Odds and Ends videos are a ton of work and get very little return value views-wise, but I do it anyway for the most hardcore fans and because the completionist in me won't let me quit. So, let's just get into it, shall we? So to begin with, we're starting with Insomnia, his soundtrack to the film of the same name. Not the Christopher Nolan directed one from 2002, but that one is a remake of this one from 1997. So this was right around the same time that Substrata came out. Good timing. The movie is basically a psychological thriller set in Norway, because of course. Centered around a detective who makes, let's say, a giant mistake during a murder investigation, and has to cover his tracks while still hunting for the killer. Oh yeah, and he's operating in a part of Norway where there's midnight sun, so as you might guess from the title, he ends up having a little trouble sleeping. No symbolism there at all either. This movie was immensely disturbing, not gonna lie. Mainly because of two uncomfortably drawn out scenes of the sexual advanced type. It's not a movie I plan on seeing a second time, but it is very well written and shot. It is a major accomplishment for a film that takes place pretty much entirely in broad daylight to be this unsettling. I will say that I've also seen Nolan's remake in English, and that was almost certainly the more enjoyable version of the movie. Wasn't as creepy, but didn't have the questionable scenes. It was more suspenseful, more like a straightforward crime thriller. Got Al Pacino and Robin Williams. I didn't have to read subtitles too. If you're interested in watching this movie, I'd more recommend watching the remake, but the original version undoubtedly had the better soundtrack. Yeah, this is one of those soundtrack albums that actually works well, completely divorced of context from the movie. It's not one I had enough to say about from like an individual track basis to put into proper video form, but there is a fair bit of variety in its mix of minimal synth doodles, very low-key but enveloping dissonant pads, strange sounds and effects, creepy piano noises. Even the track Tunnel comes in at the end and sounds kind of ambient techno, novelty waves-esque. I think there's some tracks with vocals. The majority of this album kind of reminds me of the soundtrack to the Submarine games, very creepy and dark and low-key, and I tend to enjoy this kind of stuff mainly because of that series. It does tend to fall into the background easily, and tracks often blend together without me noticing, though if I am to sit up and pay attention to the track listing, it turns out to be a pretty solid and well-paced dark ambient listen. If I do have any major critiques, it's that, well, okay, this has nothing to do with the music, but Jesus Christ, this is one of the worst album covers of all time. Just look at that. Who signed off on this? It's so fucking ugly and actively works against the mood both the movie and the soundtrack are trying to create. It looks more like a crappy YouTube thumbnail than the cover to a dead serious 1997 horror thriller movie soundtrack album. Just yikes. But despite this, the album itself is pretty good, like a 7.5 out of 10. It's worth a shot. I'd recommend the 2007 reissue just because it has an album cover that does make your eyes bleed. That's on his Bandcamp page. Moving on to his 2017 album, The Petrified Forest, which did not get a proper video given how it is only 6 tracks. It felt more like an EP more than anything. But it's pretty cool too, kinda has the same general vibe as End Plants. The highlight was probably the track that was also released as a single, Black Mesa. Same blends the track like Oi 1, deep bass lines, squeaky Mellotron-esque pads, nice synth plucking, and the catchy voice samples applied on top. Here in this desert, it's just the same thing over and over again. The other tracks are cool too, be it tracks which are basically the same blend as Black Mesa. See Turn to Stone or The Closer, This Is the End. Also Just a Kiss, although that one takes a while to get to that blend and has a fairly long intro. And the remaining two tracks have a bit more ambient focus, like the abstract modulation and airy pads of Drifter, and the title track, which has these warm but haunting pads and a jazzy breakbeat underneath that's similar to the material on Drop Sound. Overall, though, it's nothing you haven't already heard from him. It definitely got diminishing returns with repeat visits. But if you wanted more stuff like his first two albums or like Endplants, you got it here. It's probably like a solid 7 out of 10 for me. Moving on from there, Biosphere does have a couple of compilations of rare tracks, which I skipped over for the most part, as there did appear to be a lot of overlaps with reissues of his earlier albums, which I've talked about in those individual reviews. But one that did catch my interest was the massive 3-hour, 20-minute collection of Jenssen's sound installations from 2000 to 2009. As far as I can tell, this thing had no material in common with his other albums, save for a 50-minute rework of Laika, the bonus track from the most recent reissue of Substrata, and There'll Be Bluebirds Over the White Cliffs of Dover, which closed out the bonus album attached to Shenzhou, albeit with a shorter title. But the rest looked interesting since many of these tracks had pretty neat stories behind their creation. Like Fluxgate was the result of an installation where he set up like these two big spires that had like these targets attached to them so that like onlookers could throw snowballs at them. And then the target hitting as well as data instruments reading the activity of the ongoing Aurora Borealis would change the character of the music. That is pretty awesome. There's also Does Music Affect Plants, which should be self-explanatory, the use of that one, commissioned by the Sheffield Winter Gardens in the UK. Or Red Folks, described as rock carvings from the Bronze Age transformed into sound. That's interesting. Snurp 1937, which was created as part of this weird project called Sonic Vista that put MP3 players in public benches next to lighthouses or something. Well, if you click the info buttons on the Bandcamp page of this release, you get better explanations than what I just described, but still, this all sounds pretty cool. Granted, I had a feeling that those descriptions were going to be more interesting than the music itself, and, like, there are tracks that stretch on for 11, 12, 21, 23, 45, 50 minutes. 50 was the Laika rework. And being familiar with his usual style, I kinda surmised there wouldn't be a lot to these pieces, and yep, mostly true. The longest ones all do have at least a little bit of evolution, though the one for Plants was a little patience testing with all its stuttering loops. Even if it wasn't the same thing over and over, it could get a little bit irritating. The Rock Carvings one was also disappointingly dull. It just sounded like some electronic scanner. And Snurp 1937 was a creepy, dark ambient piece prominently featuring some guy yelling in a language I don't understand. I'm guessing Norwegian, though it did give me some unfortunate, probably unintentional, or maybe intentional, Nazi Germany vibes. And regardless of what Jenssen was going for, like, artistically here, I don't know if that's the kind of thing I'd want to hear coming out of a public bench. The one big bright spot here, though, was Fluxgate, which was just as sonically interesting as that initial description I gave. 23 minutes of lots of various interesting snippets and sounds from the above-mentioned snowball throwing and clunking and scraping noises as a result, to orchestral pads and dark ambient drones, a couple of drop sound-style breakbeats, quick moments of ambient techno percussion. It did genuinely keep my interest the whole time. The other tracks were nice listens, but didn't give me much to say beyond that. I liked the dark drone of microtunneling, the light, breezy, summery tones of fluvial morphology, but that's about it. The comp as a whole, it's interesting as a curiosity, and I'm assuming Jenssen didn't really put this together to be anything more than that, but is it worth sitting through all 3 hours of? No, not really. It's got its moments, though. I'm not gonna give a rating to this one. Okay, so now I think it's time to talk about some rare early albums of his. The first album he ever had his name attached to, as far as I can tell, is a self-titled release as E-Man, a synth-pop album he made in 1984 that was re-released and expanded in 2009, because why not? And yeah, this is a surreal one to get to after all this abstract ambient material. The first thing this reminds me of is like Depeche Mode's early days, like A Broken Frame or OMD self-titled maybe. It's a very 80s synth pop album that wears its influence on its sleeve, with very obvious lack of budgets and not very good recording quality. Not even consistent sound quality either. There's also singing on some of these tracks too. Well, not handled by Jenssen himself, just some friends of his, I guess. One of them sounds like the most stereotypical sounding British frontman for synth pop band, like the guy from Men Without Hats or something. And the other one has a higher voice and also is not a particularly great singer. As for whether the album is actually good, super cheap production values notwithstanding, it's alright, I guess. I don't think these are melodies that are gonna get stuck in my head anytime soon, though they're far from unlistenable. Just fun little 80s synth doodles and tunes. A couple of them are too cheap sounding and overly simplistic for my liking, though the consistent highlights were the tracks labeled Upland, which were the singular hints at Jenssen's eventual ambient directions. These are some low-key but ethereal numbers that could form some kind of atmosphere even out of this super cheap production. The instrumentals tended to be the better ones. See tracks like De Da Do Da Da Dee or Nibsy the Newsboy. Those are titles. But tracks like those are perfectly enjoyable for what they are. The vocal tracks though, those are all pretty meh. Like, the best one is probably the opener, The Difference, though even that one's nothing incredible. And the other ones, as I mentioned, the singing is pretty mediocre. Visioner and Heaven and Hell were probably the worst sounding of these. The latter at least had a good instrumental, but the singer carried a tune about as well as I can. And the former didn't even have a particularly good instrumental, just a couple of those synths that almost sound like they're phase canceling or something and have really sour non-harmonies. That track is pretty bad. But yeah, this album's got some fun moments. If all I've described sounds like something you'd enjoy, just this very low-budget synth pop thing with some cool ambient-ish moments, it's worth a shot. Am I gonna keep it around? No, and it's really not anything you absolutely need to go out of your way for. I'm personally feeling like a 5.3 out of 10. This was eh. The other early pre-Biosphere album that's worth discussion as his album is Bleep, The North Pole by Submarine from 1989. That title just sounds like the kind of imagery you'd associate with a project from this guy, doesn't it? Though the album itself really does not sound like the kind of thing you could just slap the Biosphere name on. You can see the progression from this into microgravity pretty clearly in some moments, but it is even more primitive sounding than that album was. Got some similar vibes listening to this thing that I do when I put on something like 808 State's New Build. Similarly sounds like a stepping stone into a genre that hadn't fully formed yet. It's really not aged that gracefully, but it feels like the kind of thing that absolutely would have been cutting edge in 1989. Helping usher in the sounds of the 90s before they really became a thing. Right from the outset, we hear these synth textures that are a lot harsher and much less smooth sounding than the stuff on Microgravity. Very TB303 sounding stuff with old school 808 drum machines, and especially the gratuitous use of samples, which is very much of its time. You listen to a track like the opener, A Bite of AMC, and you hear these shouting hip-hop samples talking about, "We come from the north side," or "How you feel out there." Sounds almost club ready or something. The sampling is super upfront and obvious across the board, like the track Cycle 92 even has an obvious sample of Kraftwerk's Boing Boom Chuck. It feels kind of more like a dance and hip-hop hybrid that you really could have found only like right at the end of the 80s and maybe early 90s. But it's pretty fun for what it is, all things considered. There weren't any outright clunkers here, and the opener was probably my least favorite for just having that really dated 80s hip-hop feel to it in some parts. I do not listen to Geir Jenssen to get hype, thank you very much. My favorite moments here were the more low-key moments that hinted more at the directions he'd eventually move in as Biosphere. Like A Fading Dream has lots of ethereal vocal samples alongside its synth horns and old-school synth grooves. Cycle 92, disregarding the obvious sampling, was totally eerie and spacey sounding. Take out the Boing Boom Chocks and you get a track that would have fit right at home on his first two Biosphere albums. Even with the sampling involved, that was one of my favorites. The Conway Saddle was a track that started out punchy and hard-hitting and got spookier as it went on. The Snake was a driving and propulsive ambient techno number that could be both club-ready or headphone-ready. In Your System was a dead ringer for a new build track with its super upfront acid synths. And Sure Be Glad When You're Dead was even more hip-hop-ish than other tracks on here, with its sampled breakbeats and laughing snippets. I also like the second version of A Bite of AMC at the end, subtitled The Wrong Floppy Mix, and given a bit of a more low-key makeover. One thing that did bug me, that when I was listening to this thing on Spotify, there were these pop sounds at the end of most of these tracks. It sounded like bad audio edits or something. I don't think this album is necessarily a masterpiece or is the kind of thing that I'm itching to get on my iPod, but I do think it has some undeniable historical value. I've heard this was a personal favorite of Aphex Twin's back in his early days, and that does make sense to me. And datedness notwithstanding, it's a pretty fun and enjoyable listen. I think I can award it with a 7.3 out of 10. Don't love it, but it's worth a shot. Now, while we're on the topic of his early pre-Biosphere days, I thought I might briefly touch on the two albums he worked on while in the band Bel Canto. He was on their first two albums, Whiteout Conditions and Birds of Passage, both released after E-Man but before The North Pole by Submarine. Bel Canto is, of course, a full band, also consisting of Anneli Drecker handling vocals and Niels Johansson handling keyboards and other instruments. And those two went on as a duo after Jenssen left early on. They had a bunch of albums after these first two, but I figured it was unlikely I was going to cover this band outside of this video. Likely wouldn't have caught my interest otherwise, so I just put them here, so let's get into it. I first listened to Whiteout Conditions, and I thought that album was pretty cool. It undoubtedly had higher production values than those last two Jenssen solo projects I talked about. It's kind of like a dark synth pop album, not too far removed from something you'd hear out of Depeche Mode. But more in like their Exciter period, if that. A bit of world music influence thrown in there to various extents. Maybe does have a bit of a folksy feel to it in many parts, despite being so very synth-heavy. And those 80s guitars are all over everything. Although they have the same quality as the intro of, like, Infected Mushrooms dancing with Gaddafi. It's definitely not overproduced. And it's fronted by a woman, singing in English most of the time, which after all this stuff I've gotten to is a little weird in and of itself. I've heard a lot of comparisons with this band and the band Cocteau Twins. I don't listen to them, so I can't confirm that myself, but if you're a fan of them, you may also enjoy these guys. In terms of individual tracks, this album didn't give me much to say, though there were a couple of standouts. Agassiz was like this kind of traditional Middle Eastern or Eastern European or Indian dance standard thing. I know there's a specific part of the world that makes music that sounds like this. I'm not good at identifying that. But it was a really fun and interesting track. Kloiberdans had a bit of an African flair to it with its weird melodic percussion and flutes. And the track Upland stuck out to me with its entire second half was lifted right out of the track of the same name from his E-Man project. And actually properly produced. That was a cool touch. As a whole though, this album was nice and a grower with repeat listens. I don't think I'm precisely in love with it or felt outright blown away by it. I think it takes a while to really get going, but I did probably enjoy it enough to give it a recommendation, like a 7.5 out of 10. And then there's their second album, Birds of Passage, which got a little confusing to me because there's the track listing on Spotify, which is totally out of order compared to the original track listing that I found on other versions. Like, it starts with, like, the first... Oh no. I need to go to a thing for Thanksgiving now, so there will be a lighting change right now. So, the track listing on Spotify starts with the track Look 3 compared to the original, which apparently ended with that track. I just listened to the out of order Spotify version, but all that aside, in general, I think I liked this album more than Whiteout Conditions. Most of these tracks had a rich sonic palette and really leaned into the weirder and world music influenced sides of their sound, if still sounding very 90s new age-y all the way through. Like, it's still mostly synth imitations. But there's a lot of guest musicians to help this stuff feel even more textured. I feel like Jenssen's influence is more obvious here too. Like, a lot of the melodies and chord progressions have a very similar feel to those found on Microgravity, especially noticeable on the title track here. Sounds exactly like a track from that album, but with a couple of more 80s flares and with, you know, singing on it. There's even a track called Dewy Fields, which I recognize as having the same title as one of the bonus demos attached to the Microgravity reissue. And sure enough, that demo has the same melody and progression as this Bel Canto track. Albeit that demo has a way more stripped back instrumental that's not even close to as interesting. This version was way better, just a lot more dramatic and weighty, had much more texture and bite to it. There is plenty of variety on the album too. Intravenous sounds very Depeche Mode Violator-esque with its instrumental. Continuum has a bit of a dancier feel, well again like some kind of traditional new age kind of dancey. And I think Drecker is singing in Spanish here, it's pretty fun. Picnic on the Moon was a nice moody piano driven number. Oyster has a little vibraphone sound alongside its other expansive and Asian influenced textures. And Time Without End shows Niels Johansson stepping up to the mic alongside Drecker. The one big weak point though was the track Look 3. It didn't have much interesting going on aside from some acid-ish textures, made for a really weak and underweight opener. It likely would have felt like a bonus track closing out the original album. But the rest of this thing was pretty damn solid. I was impressed even only having listened to it like once. I might even hang on to this. I can see this kind of thing being good for when I'm in the mood for something like Opus 3, I don't know. It hasn't aged particularly gracefully, you can tell right about when this album first came out, but I do have a soft spot for this kind of bubbly early 90s new age-y production. It's really good, maybe even bordering on great given how it does play to my tastes in these kinds of 90s styles. I'm gonna say 7.7 out of 10, though it is a pretty strong one. I might get into the 8 range if I listen to it more, who knows. Going from there, let's move on to some collab albums he worked on while retaining the Biosphere name. First, there's 2 albums he released in collaboration with Higher Intelligence Agency, the first of which is called Polar Sequences from 1996. In between Potachnik and Substrata. There are only 6 tracks on this one, although they are all on the longer side, 8, 9, 10, 13 minutes, so it is more of an album than the Petrified Forest was. And yeah, this was pretty cool. It is a very dark, cold, and mechanical ambient techno album that has even better production than most of Biosphere's stuff from this era. Unsurprisingly, it does a great job of setting a mood and atmosphere. It feels like I'm in some kind of abandoned shelter building in Antarctica. There are buildings nearby with people in it, but maybe not this particular one. You can hear air raid siren testing in the background on Cimmerian Shaft, or a track like Meltwater, which that lives up to its title. But it is also a techno album. You do have the very cold and mechanical tones of tracks like Snapshot Survey and Countdown to Darkness, that nevertheless remain alluring and intriguing throughout. And the shifting ambient sections of White Lightning were all cool too. Given how many Biosphere albums feel so minimalistic and often on the cheap side, especially his earlier stuff, this album did stand out in how it felt like it had a lot more sonic clarity than what I was used to from him. And these tracks sounded like they were trying to form a continuous mix of some kind, well, trying. Because I was listening to this on Spotify, and they weirdly did that like Equinox Infinity thing, where you fade out the end of the track, but you can tell that it was trying to segue more smoothly into the next track on another version. Yeah, I didn't care for that move, but whatever. And the album is still really short. It doesn't exactly have me riveted from start to finish either, or really deliver any textures I've never heard before. Got some vibes that reminded me of Monoleg and maybe a little bit of Global Communication, for instance. But all those issues aside, it is very good for what it is. I can co-sign this. Oh yeah, and there's a bonus field recording on Bandcamp if you like. It's kind of interesting. So yeah, this was cool. 7.5 out of 10, I think. The other collab album Biosphere did with Higher Intelligence Agency is called Birmingham Frequencies. This one's from 2000, around the same time as Cirque. And it has a very different sound and feel from Polar Sequences. Well, it still has some sounds in common, but in general, this is a lot less dark sounding and feels much lower stakes, trying to evoke the tones of the titular British city, and it's kind of relaxing in its familiarity, I suppose. Like, right from the outset, you get a much friendlier, more approachable, and more laid-back opener, Cannon Hill, next to other more peaceful numbers like Narrow Boat, which has these minimal harp-like melodies going up against gurgling metallic tones and clanking rhythms that make it a bit more urban-flavored, I guess? Or the repetitive rhythms of Augusta Road going up against someone dragging a piece of wood across concrete. But there's also tracks like the more fast-paced rhythms of Gas Street Blues and the 11-minute closer Midpoint, which evoke running through busy streets. And the Rotunda, which is pretty strange in its pitched, twanging guitar chords that do harmonize in a nice way sometimes, and then don't when you have other synth chords that aren't consonant with it. It's kind of strange and unnerving, but in a way that kept me interested. All these tracks are aided by field recordings to give them more of a sense of place, as you might guess. That said, I don't think I like this more than Polar Sequences. That album felt more cohesive than this one. This one's more like a random collection of tracks that feel like they belong in the same general place, you know, despite the Spotify version actually bothering to segue the tracks together here. It's kind of hard to explain. Like, Polar Sequences just had a better defined sense of place than this one does, I guess. But yeah, this was a pretty neat listen too. The production is pretty solid again, and noticeably better than the usual from this period of Biosphere's career. I guess Birmingham Frequencies is like a solid 7 out of 10, I think. Next, 2 albums he did with the artist Deathprod. Well, less albums and more split EPs. He did, there are 2 of these that he did 3 tracks and Deathprod did 4. And the first one of these is called Nordheim Transformed, so called as it is apparently a remix collection of the works of the now late composer Arne Nordheim, specifically his 1998 compilation of music concrete compositions, Electric. I haven't heard the original album, I just kind of judge this project as if it were its own thing. Jenssen contributed the tracks Transparenza, Cattedra Botanici, and Les Fleurs de Mal. Probably butchered all of those. Transparenza was really nice, had all these vibraphone sounds all over it, playing repetitive riffs and forming a mysterious atmosphere. I liked vibraphones. I liked this piece. Cattedra Botanici had plenty of dissonant and barely tonal atmosphere with strange bleeping synths and a couple of other vibraphone licks in the background. Later some really subtle string pads too. Seems to be pretty simplistic and repetitive at first, but it definitely evolves over time. And Les Fleurs de Mal was the longest of these pieces at 11 minutes, and it sounds like it has multiple parts to it, starting all pastoral and melodic, then fairly abruptly switching over into some spooky sounding material with unintelligible speaking vocals placed super far in the background. Other sounds are introduced, and then the melodic riffs are slowly reintroduced along with waves of other effects. It does definitely justify its length. As for the Deathprod pieces, well, they also kind of sound like Biosphere. Dark and cloudy and spooky ambient pieces like Warp/Warpable or the crackly Twin Decks, and interesting evolutions of Journey to the Center of the First, Part 1 and 2. Well, Part 1 is more interesting. Part 2 focused a bit too heavily on a singular, barely changing chord for me to really get into. But it was okay, I guess. And the EP, it's fine, I suppose. It all had its moments. The opener was probably the biggest highlight, though I'm probably gonna forget this exists pretty quickly. Didn't feel like writing this one. The other split EP he and Deathprod did was called Stator. Not a remix collection this time, and fairly recent too, only from 2015. Biosphere contributed the tracks Muses C, Bowed, and Space is Fizzy. Muses C was another repetitive but evolving piece that started all subtle and small sounding and slowly changed into something that would have sounded at home in the first half of End Plants. Bowed had all these repetitive waves of low-pitched bleeping synths, and Space is Fizzy had these wavering bass synths alongside shifting airy pads that gave off a tiny bit of a microgravity vibe, as other melodic elements are slowly introduced. And these tracks are all okay, I guess. Space is Fizzy is probably the best of the 3, but none of them were anything that I haven't heard out of Biosphere or really stuck out to me as anything special for him. Bit of a letdown, honestly. Deathprod's pieces, though, surprisingly turned out to be more consistently enjoyable. Shimmer/Flicker had this real menacing quality to it that reminded me a little of Hanky from Aphex Twin Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. There were some really creepy and intense build-ups in the beginning, and it switched over into some very reverb-soaked, barely tonal synth notes. Like the 2 titles of the track, it pretty clearly shows the 2 parts. The track's not exactly for the faint of heart, but I liked it in that way, kind of Submachine-ish. This track was definitely my favorite in the bunch. Polychromatic and Disc were quick pieces with blends of subtle synth notes that had a bit of a knocked blank vibe to them. Disc definitely the more evocative of the 2, while Polychromatic was basically an interlude. And finally, Optical is our big 10-minute closer, basically just a single, very airy and chilling pad that sounds like you're inside an airplane flying through the Arctic. Not much to it, but it was pretty neat. Overall, this EP was, honestly not that great. Biosphere's material was pretty disappointing, I will say, and Deathprod's stuff, while undoubtedly better, was still nothing particularly mind-blowing, personally. I don't think there's anything you absolutely need to go out of your way for, so yeah, no rating for this either. But I wanted to finish this video on a high note, so last but not least, we are finishing with The Fires of Orc. So, Jenssen made 2 albums with the ever-prolific late ambient synth master Pete Namlook, the man whose overall back catalog makes Jenssen's look like the Avalanches in comparison. I do always enjoy me some Namlook, and I was excited to hear this pair of albums since Namlook collabs can usually turn out pretty interesting material. The first Fires of Orc album is from 1993, and it sounds like a slightly instrumentally beefed up take on the kind of material you'd hear on Microgravity and Potashnek. Relatively straightforward 90s ambient techno material, but just like the Higher Intelligence Agency collabs, the production is a noticeable step up from Biosphere solo stuff from this era. And yeah, I really liked it. These tracks do unsurprisingly run really long, as most Namlook-related projects do. The track Gebirge, for instance, ran for over 20 minutes and really didn't have much progression. But I never really got sick of the sound, just really subtle, moody, ambient synth grooves that gave off that very spacey vibe. Same feelings with the 18-minute The Facts of Life. Very similar formula going into that one, if maybe a tiny bit more progression and more percussion. I think I heard some really subtle buzzing sounds that reminded me of Namlook's first self-titled album. But yeah, that track was good. Never really got sick of that one either. And Talk to the Stars, though, that is absolutely fantastic. Love the groove on this one, and its touches of synth strings and pianos and the whispered female vocals really help it go the extra mile. It's really propulsive despite never going over the top or having much percussion aside from a kick and some fast-paced filtered hi-hats. Definitely the highlight of the album for me. And the album is bookended with a title track and a reprise of said track, more solid ambient techno that wouldn't have felt out of place on those first 2 Biosphere albums. Kinda novelty wave-esque. Dark beats and menacing samples, but with subtle bleeping melodies that help drive some spacey atmosphere. Lots of really good stuff to be found here. I will say this is a very repetitive album. I don't imagine it'll be for everyone, but the well-balanced production and particular blend of sounds in each track prevent any of these grooves from overstaying their welcome in any way. This hit the spot, 7.7 on this volume. The second volume came out in 2000, after Jenssen had Substrata and Cirque under his belt. So I was hoping for some influence from those albums to come through here, and yeah, it did not disappoint. I think this volume might have even been a little better than the first. Like, right from the outset, you get In Heaven, which features lots of the same guitars from a track like Poa Alpina, going up against glassy bell sounds and synth strings and slow builds of ambient pads, very Namlook-esque. Even some cooling, wordless backing vocals from Jenny Gibbert to further enhance the mix. Sounds absolutely beautiful. When the Night Was Black is super subtle ambient stuff, starts out as just blowing Winfield recordings and whispering samples, but as it goes on, it builds up these spooky ambient pads that almost have a bit of a modern classical feel to their progressions. Also very good stuff. Sky Lounge starts out with just reversed guitar sounds carrying over a similarly minimal and spooky feel, but it turns into something really warm and comforting a few minutes in, as a repetitive sample of some other jazzy guitar loop comes in underneath, and is accompanied by more Substrata-style guitar tones, psychedelic solos, and bell sounds. The effect is really nice and even heartwarming. You got a way to focus the mind. That was cool. Similar synth patterns to those on Shukong from Substrata. Although I didn't find this one quite as riveting or interesting as some of the other pieces here. And finally we end with Nouvelles Machines, which is a turn for the much stranger and spacier. Like, it starts out with layers of really subtle bleeping in the background as if you're on the front deck of a Star Trek ship. Other rhythmic effects come in that sound like tapping giant marbles together, and finally a beat fades in to tap your foot along to, and some deep and rich, if subtle, bass lines too. Really creative and interesting stuff all around. Namlook really helped bring out Jenssen at his best. Their styles really worked off each other well and put out some stuff you really couldn't get elsewhere. I do think In Heaven and Sky Lounge are the clear standouts on this volume, and the rest didn't wow me on the same level. But all around, this is really good stuff. I think this is also a 7.7 out of 10. And the two albums together have been repackaged as a self-titled double album, The Fires of Orc by The Fires of Orc. You can look that up. If you only listen to one project that I highlight in this video, make it this one. 2 hours of material that can get a bit repetitive in parts, but easily have enough interesting material and well-balanced and immersive production to keep me invested the whole way through. So, I think I'm just gonna leave it at that. That's all the Geir Jenssen that I have the patience to talk about. I mean, again, there's other stuff I didn't feel like highlighting, but I think this video covered plenty enough. Gonna be finishing this series with a worst to best ranking, so you can look forward to that, and boy am I glad to finally have this video off my chest. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.